Hi, my name is Alvin Xia.
Hi, my name is Ho Jun Kek.
Hi, my name is Su Yan Ni.
Hi, my name is Poon Yi Hen.
I am Ashi.
Today, we will like to discuss the case of Nik and Lin Jurina binti Abdul Rashid and others against Kerajaan Negeri Kelantan.
In Nik Alin Zurina binti Nik Abdul Rashid and another against Kerajaan Negeri Kelantan, the Kelantan State Legislative Assembly enacted the Kelantan Sharia Criminal Code Enactment 2019, which came into force on the 1st of November 2021. The enactment introduced numerous Sharia criminal offences applicable specifically to Muslims in Kelantan. Among the offences created were provisions relating to sodomy, incest, sexual harassment, gambling, intoxication, destruction of places of worship, false doctrines, and acts considered contrary to the precepts of Islam. The enactment aimed to strengthen the administration and enforcement of Islamic criminal law within the state of Kelantan.
These laws exceed the state's powers. We must challenge this in the federal court.
In 2022, the petitioners, the Kelantanese lawyer Nik Alin Zurina binti Nik Abdul Rashid and her daughter, commenced a constitutional challenge directly before the federal court under Article 4, Clause 4, and Article 128, Clause 1, Paragraph 8 of the Federal Constitution. The petitioners sought declarations that 18 provisions of the Kelantan Sharia Criminal Code Enactment 2019 were unconstitutional, null and void. They argued that the Kelantan State Legislative Assembly lacked the legislative competency to enact those provisions because the subject matters substantially concerned general criminal law, which falls exclusively under the jurisdiction of Parliament pursuant to Item 4 of the Federal List in the 9th Schedule of the Federal Constitution. The petitioners contended that the impugned provisions overlap with existing federal criminal offences governed under laws enacted by Parliament, particularly the Penal Code. The petitioners further argued that although state legislatures possess authority under Item 1 of the state list to create offences against the precepts of Islam applicable to Muslims, such power is not unlimited. The state's legislative authority is expressly restricted by the preclusion clause, which excludes matters already included within the federal list. Therefore, the petitioners maintain that the impugned provisions were unconstitutional because the state legislature had exceeded the constitutional limits imposed by the federal constitution. In the court, the petitioners argued that the Parliament holds the exclusive power to enact general criminal laws under Item 4 of the Federal List in the 9th Schedule of the Federal Constitution, and state legislatures cannot duplicate or usurp this power. The Kelantan state government defended the validity of the enactment by arguing that the challenged provisions were enacted specifically to regulate offences committed by Muslims against the precepts of Islam. The respondent contended that the provisions were intended to preserve Islamic morality, protect the sanctity of Islam, and regulate the conduct of Muslims within the state. The state government also argued that the federal court should adopt a broader interpretation of the state's legislative powers concerning Islamic law and religious offences.
The first issue was whether they had standing. Respondents argued they were busybodies. The court adopted a broad interpretation, ruling they had genuine interest.
The first issue was whether the petitioners had sufficient standing to challenge the constitutionality of the enactment. The respondent argued that the petitioners were busybodies and had shown no actual infringement of rights. The court therefore had to determine whether a person must prove actual injury before challenging unconstitutional legislation, and whether public interest constitutional litigation should be permitted. In an 8-1 majority ruling, the Federal Court dismissed the respondents' objections and held that the petitioner did have the local standard to maintain the constitutional challenge. The majority established a broad and liberal test for legal standing in constitutional reviews, effectively lowering the traditional threshold for public interest litigation. The Federal Court held that in a constitutional review under Article 4, Clause 4 of the Federal Constitution, the primary duty of the court is to uphold the supreme law of the land, requiring a far more relaxed approach to legal standing. Under Article 4, Clause 4 of the Federal Constitution, a person needs to show they have a genuine interest to challenge the legislative competency of a state assembly. The majority ruled that as Muslims and Malaysian citizens born in Kelantan, the petitioners possess a genuine bona fide interest in ensuring that the laws governing them are validly enacted. Chief Justice Tengku Maimun stated that allowing a strict interpretation of local standard would block citizens from challenging a state legislative assembly that completely oversteps its legal powers. The rule of law would be compromised if unconstitutional laws were allowed to remain on the books simply because no one had been prosecuted under them yet.
The second issue was whether the federal court has proper jurisdiction. The court held that it had full authority, leaves exclusive jurisdiction was properly invoked.
The second issue was whether the Federal Court possesses the proper exclusive jurisdiction under Article 128 Clause 1 Paragraph A of the Federal Constitution to hear and determine the petition. The Federal Court held that it had the full legal authority to hear and determine the petition under Article 128 Clause 1 Paragraph A of the Federal Constitution. Then, the majority ruled that Article 128 Clause 1 Paragraph A of the Federal Constitution specifically provides that only the Federal Court can determine the validity of law passed by the Parliament or state legislature. Because the petitioners were directly challenging the competency of the Kelantan State Assembly to pass the criminal laws, the subject matter fell exclusively within Article 128 Clause 1 Paragraph A of the Federal Constitution. A challenge under Article 128 Clause 1 Paragraph A cannot proceed unless a single Federal Court judge grants leave under Article 4 Clause 4 of the Federal Constitution. The majority held that once leave was formally granted by a single judge, the exclusive original jurisdiction of the Federal Court was properly invoked.
The third issue concerned legislative competency over criminal law. The question was the State Assembly exceeded its powers. The court found that their pith and substance was general criminal law.
The third issue before the Federal Court was whether the Kelantan State Legislative Assembly had exceeded its legislative powers or acted ultra vires by enacting 18 provisions in the Kelantan Sharia Criminal Code Enactment 2019. The Federal Court held that the State Assembly had indeed exceeded its powers and struck down 16 out of the 18 challenged provisions. The court found that in their pith and substance, these provisions dealt with general criminal law, which falls under Item 4 of the Federal List, and is therefore within Parliament's exclusive legislative authority. In reaching this decision, the court established that a valid state law must concern an offence against the precepts of Islam. Such offences either relate to matters specifically listed in Item 1 of the state list and apply only to Muslims, or they are purely religious offences involving Islamic faith, morality, or the sanctity of Islam. Even then, if the true subject matter overlaps with areas assigned to the Federal List, the state legislature has no power to enact it. Applying the pith and substance test, the court found that several provisions actually regulated matters under federal jurisdiction. For example, Section 11 on places of worship concern public order and hate crimes, Section 14, 16, and 17 on natural sexual acts, necrophilia, and acts involving animals, Section 31 on sexual harassment, Section 34 on perjury and false evidence, and Section 47 on incest were all forms of general criminal law. Likewise, Section 36 on intoxicating substances, Section 37 subsection 1 paragraph B on gambling, Section 39 on fraudulent measurements, Section 40 and Section 41 on Islamic finance and banking, Section 42 on halal certification, and Sections 43, 44, 45, and 48 on the solicitation of prostitution all fell within areas reserved for Parliament, making them unconstitutional. However, the court upheld Section 13 and 30 of the enactment as constitutionally valid. Section 13, concerning the custody of Muslim children, was held to protect a child's Islamic faith and falls within Item 1 of the State List and Article 11, Clause 4 of the Federal Constitution. Section 30, which prohibits the spread of false doctrines among Muslims, was recognized as a purely religious offense relating to Islamic faith and morality rather than general criminal law. Therefore, both provisions, which are Section 13 and Section 30 of the enactment, were held to be within the legislative competence of the Kelantan State Legislative Assembly.
The decision strongly reinforced the constitutional principle of federalism by reaffirming the division of legislative powers between Parliament and the state legislatures under the Federal Constitution. The Federal Court emphasized that legislative authority is distributed through the Ninth Schedule, which divides the legislative powers between Parliament and the state legislatures through the Federal List, State List, and Concurrent List. Parliament has exclusive authority to legislate on matters enumerated in the Federal List, while state legislatures may only enact laws on matters assigned to them under the State List. The court made clear that states cannot legislate on matters assigned to Parliament merely because those matters also relate to Islam.
In this landmark case, the petitioners challenged the constitutionality of several provisions under the Kelantan Sharia Criminal Code Enactment 2019. The core issue centered around a critical dilemma whether a state legislature had overstepped its constitutional boundaries by enacting laws on criminal matters that already fall under the primary jurisdiction of the federal government. When comparing how Malaysia's political system aligns with the United States, the most major similarity is that both systems rely completely on written Supreme Constitution to divide and protect federal and state powers. In both nations, power is legally carved out by supreme law. In Malaysia, this is established under Article 4 of the Federal Constitution, utilizing the Ninth Schedule. Similarly, the United States Constitution establishes itself as the supreme law under Article 6, alongside the 10th Amendment. Furthermore, both systems utilize a supreme judicial body, the federal court here and the Supreme Court in America, to act as the ultimate arbiters protecting these constitutional boundaries. However, while both nations use a written constitution, the way they actually distribute that power is completely opposite. I will now pass the presentation over to my teammate to discuss these differences.
Now, let us compare Malaysian federalism with the federal system in the United States. In Malaysia, the legislative powers are divided through the Federal List, State List, and concurrent list under the federal constitutions. This creates a more centralized federal system where the federal government holds a greater authority, while the states have more limited autonomy. In contrast, the United States follow the 10th Amendment, which reserve powers not specifically given to the federal governments to the states. As a result, the US has a more decentralized federal systems, granting the states greater autonomy and a broader legislative powers. Therefore, the key difference is that the Malaysia emphasizes stronger federal control and a national uniformity, whereas the US allows states to exercise wider powers in governing local matters. In conclusion, the Nik Eiling case decided in 2024 reaffirmed the principle of the constitutional supremacy in Malaysia. The Federal Court clarified the constitutional division of powers between the federal government and the state governments. These decisions help maintain a proper federal-state balance and strengthens Malaysia's federal system by ensuring that each level of the government acts within its constitutional authority. The key takeaway is that the Malaysian Constitution remains the supreme law of the country and continues to reinforce the constitutional division of powers between the federal government and the state governments. Thank you.